let's just start. Hey everyone, thanks for coming out. My name is Johnny Harris. I am a video maker at VOX, and I've got a lot of stuff to talk about today, but I also am more interested in hearing questions about what we talk about and what you guys do and how what I do, which is one kind of very specific thing, can help you in your work and your perspective. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I've got some slides here. I'm going to tell some stories and kind of give some context. But then I want to dive into kind of more of a back and forth and hear questions and get specific. Like I want to hear your questions about the gear and the actual techniques that I use, or about the storytelling process, or anything that I don't kind of cover in this first section. I want to get nitty gritty. And then I'm going to open up some of my scripts and give you some like real kind of behind the scenes of how I think about storytelling and how I use paper, like, well, Google Docs, but how I use like writing to help frame out and flesh out stories before I go out into the world and try to capture stuff. So first, for those who are not familiar, Borders is a series that I do at VOX. It's a documentary series about borders, and it's kind of trying to explain the human stories behind the map, or inside of the map. I want to first talk about what VOX is. VOX is a US-based outlet that is in the business of explaining the news or helping people understand the news. When I tell people I work at VOX, they always think that I'm saying Fox. They're like, oh, you work at Fox News. And I'm like, no, I don't work at Fox News. I work at VOX with a V. Before VOX was actually big enough for people to recognize that, they just defaulted to Fox. But we're very different than Fox. Okay, so VOX is a company that is in the process of trying to reinvent what it means to understand the news, or to explain the news is kind of this word we use. The word explain, the language here is actually really important for us. It's not just, explain for us doesn't just mean like listicles of like really easy to understand things, and like explain for us has a very kind of specific meaning. We believe that there is a lot of information out in the world. There's no issue now with getting good information. There's plenty of research being done that is almost like too specific for any one person to really grasp. And it's too niche and too kind of specialized. And so our whole idea is that this information is so specialized and so abundant that it's often like behind a wall. See my clicker, there we go. So when news hits, our job is to surround that news with all of that information. We call it context. Basically all the research, the data, the policy reporting. We call people, we read think tank reports, and then we communicate that to a mass audience in a way that they can understand it, or a way that connects with them. Usually using internet language, like whether that's writing or text or graphics or video in my case. The philosophy is the same for whatever we do. It's basically taking complex topics and funneling them to a mass audience in a way that is still rigorous but is easy to understand. And the result is not some dense policy paper. It's something that feels native to the internet. It's something that feels approachable. But if you were to read this piece, it would be still not dumbing it down, not oversimplifying it. It would be still pulling on the theories and the reporting that's done to make it a good piece of journalism, but just more accessible to a broader audience. So we've got numbers, and who cares about numbers? I want to talk about video. For me, video is kind of the thing that I've focused on, and blending this philosophy of explaining with video itself. A lot of news outlets are interested in video these days, and we often get asked, and I personally get asked a lot from other news outlets who are often trying to poach those of us at VOX. What is it about your team, or like what are you doing that allows you to tell these interesting stories and make these beautiful videos? In short, they ask like, one guy from the New York Times is like, well, what's the secret sauce of VOX video? And so I thought about that for a little bit, and I was like, well, what is the secret sauce? And that's what I want to talk about today, is like, what is the recipe to our secret sauce? And spoiler alert, it's not a secret. It's like pretty basic things, but I feel like talking about this and breaking this down will kind of give you an idea of where my show came from and where VOX came from, because it's all part of the same philosophy. The first kind of component of this is this idea of empowering creators to make what they're interested in. My boss at the time, Joe, when I asked him this question, like, well, hey, what's our secret sauce? He was like, we just hire creative people and we are curious people and we let them make stuff. Like we let them make stuff instead of assigning them to make stuff. And what this looks like is, well, I'll kind of break down what the kind of old model was in journalism, and still is in a lot of places. And I don't want to disparage this old model because there's actually a lot of rational reasons why we did this old model, which is the model is that you have a writer, someone who's good with the facts and understands fact-checking and writing and prose and journalism. And then you have like the technician, the person on the other side who's like knows how to press the buttons and run the camera and edit the thing. And there's always kind of been a bright line between those two. And for good reason. If you're churning out, like daily news hits and breaking news, you need to specialize. At VOX, and then of course on top of all of that, you have like an editor or like an idea, we call it an ideas leader, like someone on top of that who's assigning what everyone should be doing. We have to cover this, and writer, you write this, technician, you do this. At VOX, we've kind of been in the process of saying, like, what happens if we revamp this model and dissolve this? And here, my clicker's a little bit delayed. So instead of that being, here, I'll go back one, because instead of there being a divide between the two, we see all of these people who come in, my colleagues are kind of from all over the place. We see them as creators. They come from a bunch of different backgrounds. I personally came from an international relations background. No film school, no journalism school. Everyone's just a creator, okay? You come into VOX, you're a creator. And then this ideas leader up top is not necessarily the person assigning, but is rather someone, an editor, who we call a facilitator. Instead of assigning, it's more of, creator, what do you want to work on? And what can we surround you with that you're not good at? Like for me, I had a little bit of design background. I knew international relations, but like I wasn't a very good writer when I came into VOX. And I didn't really understand fact checking very well. And I didn't have like really formal typography and color theory, but my colleagues did. And my colleagues would help me. My editor, facilitator, would help me improve in these other things that I didn't know. This isn't we all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and everyone's happy and like there's no like rigorous feedback. This is a really intense process actually. What this means is I'll write a script, and I've never written a script before. I don't come from a journalism background. And my editor will look at it and just tear it apart and say like, hey, this is so factually thin, or you have no good evidence for this, or like, what are you doing here? And then the art director will look at it and be like, man, these colors are really clashing, or this animation is really clunky. Like, it's intense, it's rigorous, but what that does is it turns the creator into someone who can do like 4 or 5 different things. And maybe they didn't start out that way, but the team culture of this idea of, hey, you have an idea, we want you to make it, and we'll facilitate that however you need, has helped us create these people who can wear a lot of hats. Now again, this is hard to scale, and there are challenges that come with this managerially and from a company standpoint. But what this does is it creates an environment of experimentation and creativity. And it allows a creator who's used to maybe getting assignments to feel like, oh, I have an idea and I have the power to kind of execute on that idea. And so I don't necessarily recommend that the world do this. I don't recommend that every organization, this model doesn't necessarily fit for a lot of organizations. But what we can learn from this is that there's power in one creator having multiple tasks and having the kind of power to have their own vision, and that being given to them as opposed to kind of it being divided up so much to where they're kind of involved in one specific thing. And so there are ways to blend this with the old model. And at VOX, we're having to do that as we grow. We're now kind of a bigger team, and this original model doesn't look as much like this. We're doing a lot more collaborating and a lot more kind of drawing some lines, but this original ethos is still a big part of our team and the DNA of our team. So the second thing that is really important to us is the idea of aesthetic and style. I think there's always been this idea that like aesthetics and good looks are for like the brands and the commercials and for the people with big budgets and stuff like that. And in news and in documentary and stuff like that, like we're just here to tell the story. Story is king. It doesn't have to look very nice. And while I agree with the idea that story is king, well, story is the most important, a good story that's delivered really well, that's delivered in a way that makes you feel something or that is beautiful to watch, to me can go further and to me can actually have a greater effect than a story that is told without those stylistic concerns and kind of taken into account. So that's been a big part of ours, and it takes a little bit more time, but we feel like our stories can go further because of that. Here's a little sample of a few pieces. I'll just go through. I'm sure some of you guys have already seen VOX stuff, but here's a few pieces from my colleagues. Oh, and we don't have audio. Yes, we do.
That story begins far away and many years before the group existed. In 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to defend a puppet dictator against rebels.
I think everybody would say, oh yeah, there must be a spike for World War I. You know, sure enough, there it is, like 25 million. And there must be a big spike for World War II, and there it is, it's like 65 million. But then you'll see this other spike that is as large as World War II, right after World War I, and most people, a lot of people would say, well, what? What was that?
The party has undergone a remarkable transformation from the party of Abraham Lincoln to the party of Donald Trump.
Earth has gone through immense climate changes many, many times before, in some cases leading to mass extinctions. But life persisted. Mammals evolved from reptiles and primates from mammals. They stood up and walked out of Africa, eventually reaching the corners of every continent. But only after well over 100,000 years of wandering.
Okay, so you get the idea. You could, if for more, go watch the VOX channel. We really put a lot of work into aesthetics, and that is because that video about climate change, or that video about the Republican Party, we could have got it done quicker, and it could have gone out in a quicker way, and maybe not put so much time into the style. But because we did that, it was able to last longer, and it was able to be something that was evergreen and that would travel. We find that on the internet, things travel and are recycled in the algorithm when they're compelling and fun to watch. And that doesn't mean that it's dumbed down. It's not like we're just making, now entertainment. It's all pretty and beautiful. It's still the rigorous stuff. It's just clothed in this really beautiful style that people want to watch. So that's a big ingredient per se in our secret sauce. The next one is this idea of respecting intelligence. And Ezra Klein, our founder, really, really believes in this idea. This idea is that we hear so much on the internet that the internet is deteriorating our attention spans, and it's giving us all ADD, and we're just scrolling through, and we have to make these 90-second videos if we're going to survive on the internet. And I believed in that. Like, for a long time, we made 2-minute videos because we're like, it's the internet. You got to make 2-minute videos. And then we started to find that some of our stories couldn't fit into 2 minutes, and so we started to make 3-minute videos, and then kind of 3 to 4. I remember in 2015, people would ask me, well, what's the sweet spot for time? And I'd be like, 3 to 4 minutes. That's it. This is absolute truth. And then I remember it was the Syrian civil war came around and became really in the limelight, and people wanted to understand it. And the foreign editor at VOX at the time said to me, well, why don't we make a video about the Syrian civil war that actually explains it? No one's done this. A lot of people have done these big articles, like who's fighting whom and why and blah, blah, blah. And so we put together a script, and I just did the word count and divided it by 160 words a minute, which is kind of our guideline of how long talking is. And it was 6 minutes long. And we're like, whoa, 6 minutes. No one's going to watch a 6-minute video. And so my bosses were like, hey, you got to cut it down. 6 minutes is way too long for video. So we tried to cut it down, and we're like, we can't cut this down. It's the Syrian civil war. You can't cut down. There's so many different players, and to really explain it well, you need at least 6 minutes. And so we're like, all right, we'll make it, and no one's going to watch it, but at least it'll be on there. It'll be our service to the readers, whatever. And so we made it. We made this 6-minute video that was not even, it wasn't even super flashy. It was just one take of a camera kind of floating around the map, and you see all these people moving and this and that. And this became our most viral video of all time, our most viewed video ever. Got 100 million views, last I checked, 100 million views on Facebook. On Facebook, the ADD platform that is supposed to only reward cat videos and entertainment. Suddenly a 6-minute video about geopolitics in the Middle East just got 100 million views and was going bonkers on the internet. And we're like, what do we do with this? And so that really reshaped our paradigm. We realized there's no limit to this. There's no natural law that 6 minutes or 3 to 4 minutes or whatever. So we started to push it. We started to push it a little bit more. And then we wanted to explain the Israel-Palestine conflict, which, as you all know, is not an easy task or a fun task or something you should ever do on the internet if you don't want a lot of hateful comments. And so I wrote the script with Max, the foreign editor, and it was 10 minutes long. And again, they laughed. Like, what I loved about my editors at that time is like they were like, that's crazy, but like try it. At the beginning of VOX, it was just this idea, like, let's just see. We don't know what we're doing. So we made this 10-minute video, and sure enough, it did super, super well. It continues to do super well, years later. And so all of this is to say, the lesson here is, let's not assume that our audiences on the internet only want to watch 90-second videos, because it's not true. If you earn their attention for 10 minutes or for 6, 7 minutes, they will watch it. They'll watch it for 15 minutes. What's that? Yeah. You want to see part of it, you said? Oh, I don't have it up, but I could, let's see. I could probably find it really quick. Yeah, I'll give you the first bit of it. Here we go. So Syrian Civil War VOX. Let's see what happens. There it is. Very intense.
Syria's war is a mess.
Here, I'll go into it, because this beginning part is not my best work.
The region and the world start traveling to Syria to join the rebels. Now, Assad actually encourages this by releasing jihadist prisoners to tinge the rebellion with extremism and make it harder for foreign backers to support them. In January 2012, Al-Qaeda forms a new branch in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra. Also around that time, Syrian Kurdish groups who had long sought autonomy take up arms and informally secede from Assad's rule.
Okay, so it's this for 6 minutes and 45 seconds, which it's not the most engaging in the sense that, like, from my perspective, I made this like 2 or 3 years ago. I'm like, man, I could have done this better. Anyway, the point though is that this met a need. People wanted to understand this, and this was a visual that was going to help them understand what's the deal with the Kurds, and how did ISIS get, and who are all these people, and what's Iran doing, and all this stuff. So the whole lesson here is the idea that we shouldn't assume what our audience wants. We should assume that our audience wants to learn stuff. So this model, back to this, which was kind of the first thing we talked about, is in 2017 is what spurred on Borders. Borders is this international series where I am kind of blending the typical map explainer with documentary. And into the first season, I kind of jumped across and did, there's a whole intro video that we don't need to watch. Did 6 different episodes in a bunch of different places, from Mexico to Norway to the northern border of Mexico to Nepal and a bunch of others. And what this has done is kind of helped us push our ethos of there I am with a yak in like the Himalayas, talking about the border of China and Nepal, which is interesting. I'll go back to this for a sec. What this has done is helped us blend this idea of explainer and this idea of wanting to help people understand the news with what does this mean when we actually go on the ground, and instead of just doing this from our office, how do we do this actually in the field? And it came with this crowdsourcing component where I'm this person who, grew up in the United States, and here I am trying to go out and report on these other places. I felt woefully unprepared to do that. And so I wanted there to be a crowdsourcing component to basically say, hey, we're on the internet. Like, the internet is the place where ideas are shared and people share and contribute and love to be a part of a big thing. What if we use that in our reporting? And so we started to gather these local communities in different places. So Hong Kong was the first experiment in this. Go to Hong Kong, and instead of just going with my own research, I put a poll out and said, anyone who lives in Hong Kong who wants to help contribute to this project, sign up. So they sign up, they put their name, their email, and they give me like what they think I should cover. So now I have all these cool ideas. And then every week, I would follow up with these people with my questions. I would say, hey, what are visual ideas or concrete examples of Chinese encroachment in Hong Kong? What are some examples of British, like relics of British influence in Hong Kong? How do I cross the border in the north? What's it like up there? All these questions, and these Hong Kongers would respond. I would get hundreds of responses to these and would just read through. And before ever going, I felt like I was reporting on the ground because there was this group of people who were with so much local knowledge who were giving me like tons and tons of amazing, like useful information, visual information that I could just have never gotten if I was just like, typing on the internet, trying to find this stuff on my own. And so what that did is it allows us to tell these really amazing stories that we uncovered through this local network. We've done it in Hong Kong. Recently we were in Colombia, and then I just got back from India. All of this crowdsourced, all the ideas were crowdsourced. Go ahead.
How did you verify these people?
So we put an announcement out to our network. So we make a video that says, hey, I'm going to Hong Kong. If you live in Hong Kong, go to vox.com/bordershong Kong.
No, but I mean not how you rectify, how you verify.
Oh, how do you verify? Well, if they...
I mean in Hong Kong especially.
Totally. So if there was ever any information that they were giving us that was fact-based, we would go fact check it. Like it was these people were more giving me information that was like for example, what are concrete examples? This was one of my big questions. What are concrete examples of Chinese encroachment? They'd say, oh, if you are on the buses, you'll hear Mandarin now. We speak Cantonese here, but more and more you're hearing Mandarin everywhere. That's not something I need to necessarily verify that person. I'll go to Hong Kong and I'll listen to that and I'll film it. Or, hey, the army barracks in the center of town is a really good visual example of the Chinese army in the middle of Hong Kong. So a lot of it was like that kind of stuff. It was like source stuff that exists in the public sphere that I just don't know because I'm not a local.
And how do you create kind of both of the sides, story, objective, as far as you can get? Like, you get kind of ones that you can
Totally.
in Hong Kong, so...
Yeah, and that's a major challenge to this model, which is like we have a demographic of like 18 to 35-year-olds. They're younger, liberal, like Hong Kongers who are obviously... Yeah, they have a very specific point of view. And that actually is like the big kind of weakness of this is the sampling error where it's like we have like one... So often when it's opinion-based stuff, like how do you feel about Chinese encroachment, I'll take that with a huge grain of salt. I'll be like, okay, how do you feel about Chinese encroachment? All these people are going to say they hate it. I need to go look at the opinion polls from University of Hong Kong, who's done legitimate polling to the public, and I'll use that for my like public opinion thing. I'm not going to use this as a scientific thing. I'm going to use this as a way to mine the locals for perspective that I just can't have. And sometimes that is subject to bias, but often it's stuff that isn't really contaminated with bias.
Chinese sources also?
Well, it's for stuff like this where it's like, again, these are like concrete examples that I'll need to go and like film that are showing a certain thing. For anything that is subject to bias, certainly it would be like go check all sides, do the normal due diligence.
It's like people that are more prone to cooperate with like someone who's American, Western. So it's like even sending this and it's like in English, you narrow the
Certainly.
amount of people that can contribute to you.
Yeah. That's a weakness. Like if I wish I could have a like poll of every single person in Hong Kong and speak Cantonese, this is my way of basically penetrating and understanding a place that I've never been to and getting an idea of what visuals like go along with the broader reporting project I'm involved in. So I don't use these people as the only source or even the main source. I use them, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about visuals and the importance of visuals in storytelling. Visuals for me are like gold. Like when I go to a place with my camera, the story doesn't exist unless there are visuals to help explain that story, visual anchors. What locals do is they're like my fixers. They're like local fixers who will help point me in directions, not necessarily that will influence the nature of the character of the story, but will at least help me find like check marks in the story that I can point my camera at and say like, here's a great example of Chinese encroachment in Hong Kong. I could have found that otherwise if I just would have like culled the internet for a year, but this is a kind of a fast track way to get an overview of the place.
How do you decide which kind of stories to do? There's so many around the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. How do I decide what stories to do? And I think that's I think going to be like the second half of today is going to be talking about what stories should be told in video and what should not. If there are a million good stories that should be reported on in the world, my philosophy is that 900 should be told as videos. The rest should be text or photo essays or interactive graphics or long-form magazine articles. Video, to me, is seen as like this cool new thing, and we should make everything a video. My thought is we should only put the work into making a video for stuff that's inherently visual that needs to be explained or understood visually. So that's my main guidepost, is what is visual and will the visual anchors guide me to a really, really good story that's compelling. But no, that's like a huge challenge of like.
I don't think what is the most popular, how I get the most of the views. It's not your.
I mean, I think timeliness, it makes a difference in the sense that like we want to make sure that the stories we're telling are useful and like relevant to our audience, but popular, or in terms of like what's going to get the most views, is not the guiding principle. It's more like, is this visual? Is this timely? Is this useful? So more about crowdsourcing and storytelling later. I do want to talk a little bit about what Borders looks like from a tactical standpoint, from like a kind of behind the scenes standpoint, because I think it's easy to see this and see like all these flashy visuals and assume that it's just all this like very seamless, smooth process. And I want to tell you a quick story about what it actually looks like when I'm on the ground, because I report by myself. I'll go with my camera. I'll usually have a fixer translator. But because of that, it basically shows, I want to show you kind of what it means to do this on a very low budget as a one-person band, as it were. So I was in Haiti in the first season of Borders, and I was in this little town way down here in the south with all of these fishing boats. It's like a fishing village. And every night there are these groups of women who kind of load up onto this boat, and they take this long journey like along the southern coast of Haiti to the border with the Dominican Republic. And they do this because along this route, if you go to the Dominican Republic, there's this really nice border market right here at the border. And they do this because there's this big mountain range here, so they can't drive. And it's economically in their interest. And there's this kind of binational, it's supposed to be like this cooperation between the two countries. And so they do this night journey every single night. And it's grueling, and just, I wanted to see it firsthand. So I went on the boat with these merchant women. We arrived to this border, and the border market's up there. This is Haiti. And there's this bridge with a guard. And the guard stops the merchant women from, they've just been on this 8-hour boat ride overnight. It's like dawn. And they kind of sit there. And this was a really powerful visual for me because it shows the asymmetry that exists on the island. It shows the idea that the Dominicans really have the upper hand, and that these women are just sitting there at the mercy of this one border guard who can either let them in to go sell and like do what they came to do, or stop them as long as they want. And I wanted to capture that as best I can. And again, with being one person, I like have my drone and I have like my camera and I'm trying to interview people, and I want to capture this whole thing. So I get my drone up in the air, and my dream shot was to get like all of these women like rushing in as soon as they open the gate. And I didn't know when they were going to open the gate. I was like, this could happen in 5 minutes or 2 hours. And so I kind of just let it up there. And the cool thing about drones is like you can just let them sit and they will not do anything. So you can like put the controller in your pocket. And so let it sit up there for a bit, and went and started interviewing people, like getting the B-roll that I needed, having these interesting conversations. And the drone's just kind of sitting up there. Well, drones have batteries, and batteries tend to run out. And so luckily drones are very safe. And so after, like when it's 10% left, the drone will just come home kind of on its own. And you can like override that, but you shouldn't. So it comes home, it lands, I change the battery out, put another one in, go back to reporting, talking to these people. I'm on my like third battery at this point, and I'm like really like, man, I want to get this shot so bad, you know, and like I tend to just push a little bit in these moments where I'm like, this shot would just really make this piece and make this kind of climactic moment. And it's on the last battery, and the drone starts to like beep at me again. So I'm like swiping to be like override, like, come on, just like one last second, like any moment it's gonna open. And it gets to a point where the drone like actually just starts coming home on its own. Like you can't override it. It's like you're an irresponsible pilot. Like we're coming home whether you like it or not. And so finally it's like starting to do that. And I'm like, oh, I failed. And like right in that moment, they open the gate. So like the drone's like actually still filming, it's coming home, and like the people are like rushing through, and I'm like getting the shot, and I'm like filming. And it's like this moment where I'm just like, this is ridiculous. Like, what am I doing? Like this should be, like I should have like a drone pilot here who like actually knows what they're doing. But it also shows to me this idea of like, these tools, we have these little tools that are, you know, my drone is like, can fit in your pocket. And yet you can use them and push them in ways that allow you to tell interesting visual stories without needing a big crew, without needing to go to film school or things like that. The final,
Tension grows.
this is the final what it
And
looked
then,
like.
Finally, hours after the Dominicans were allowed to enter, the guards open up the bridge.
There's the shot.
They buy and sell for the day before returning to the boats to make the journey home. The grueling boat journey, the senseless discrimination, it embodies the asymmetry that exists on this island. Watching it happen, it's impossible not to ask how it got like this.
So you see that shot where it's like zooming in, and like that's the drone like literally coming home. Like it was just some serendipitous moment. So it's a funny thing, and like maybe a little irresponsible, but the reason I show you this is to kind of give you an idea of what the behind the scenes looks like for this. Like it is a lot of scrappy shoestringing to get shots and to be on the ground and to interview people. Go ahead.
Do you think that can become part of our reporting, in the sense that the fact that you had to wait that long to get the shot shows how long these women had to wait? And if we let, as reporters, if we let the audience more into the backdrop, they can see and feel that we were there.
Totally. So this gets to a point that I teeter-totter back and forth on, because you'll see with Borders that a lot of it is kind of like vlog, where it's like I'm walking around and talking. And it's this kind of tension that I feel where it's like, I'm an outsider coming in to shed light on an issue. And there's a fine line between me doing that in an objective kind of way where I'm providing information or providing a bridge into this community, and where it becomes indulgent to me and my reactions to the place. And that's the last thing I want. Like that is and that's like the most, like that's the thing that to me would be the most egregious kind of version of like an insensitivity in this reporting. And so I do a lot of those things. Like I'll be on the ground and I'll kind of give reflections, and I'll be like, oh my gosh, we've been waiting so long. And in this, I do a little bit of that. I do kind of say like, we've been like waiting, because I've been on the journey with these women this whole time, and now kind of waiting. But obviously, like if I wanted to, I could go cross. And like, so it's tempting to be like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Like, I can't believe we're waiting. And yet to kind of also acknowledge the fact that like, no, I'm an outsider who's not subject to this. And like, I'm not going to indulge myself in this moment. Because a lot of vlog kind of format is a personal reflection. People talk to the camera and they talk about what they're seeing and what they're feeling and blah, blah, blah. And my whole project is to try to take the vlog format and funnel it into journalism, and funnel it into something that is telling someone else's story, but through me as like this kind of proxy for the viewer of asking the right questions. So anyway, that's a whole nother can of worms that gets to the kind of moral dilemma. But yeah, I do think that there is room for reporters to show behind the scenes as a means of visual evidence for the viewer to understand it better. And I think as long as it's in service to the viewer and in service to the story, and not kind of a self-reflective, indulgent thing, then it's totally appropriate. But that's a very fraught, fine line that I think about a lot. So I want to ask, I kind of want to hear your guys' questions about either what we talked about at the beginning of the different components of what makes VOX VOX, or what makes Borders in terms of like the gear and the workflow and the reporting and the process. We're gonna get into like actual scripts and stuff, but I'm curious if people have any questions up until now. Yeah.
I have a like unrelated question.
Yeah.
How old is your oldest staff member?
At VOX?
Yeah.
Probably like, I mean, we have people in like their 50s at VOX. Yeah. Why do you ask?
Because it's really hard communicating these types of like visual content to people, even if they did that, especially if they did that for like 30 years.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
show them this, and they're like,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. There is, I definitely, and so I definitely feel that pushback of, and it's not even, I mean, maybe age is correlated here, but it's more of a kind of approach, kind of a legacy approach where it's like, this is the way we do things in legacy media. And oh, the kids are doing this these days. They're ruining journalism. You know, like there's definitely that. And I get that. Luckily at VOX, we were started with this idea of, you know, we're gonna start out on an internet native, the right foot, so that these things are encouraged. And sometimes we go too far. Sometimes we're like, sometimes we push it so far that we're like, no, we need to be quirky and internet-y, and we forget the journalism. At least at the beginning, we kind of swung too far that way. I think we're now in a really good place where we're doing rigorous stuff that is, you know, getting nominated for Emmys and whatever, and yet it's also native to the internet. But that's a culture thing, you know, and that's like, that was our intention from the beginning. I feel like there's a lot of legacy media companies, at least that I see when I go around in Europe and et cetera, that are trying to do this. But yeah, it's an appetite thing. It needs to be an appetite from the top for that to be the change. Yeah.
Who are your viewers around the world? How do you make money?
Mm-hmm.
In one observation, you're not a news organization. You don't cover news. You don't do news. You tell stories about the news, right? Small documentaries.
Yeah. Well, right? So Vox. Well, Vox, the Vox.com. Me personally, with Borders, no, I don't cover breaking news or you're right. It's more documentary about current events. Vox.com, the website, is a news organization. In the United States, it's classified as a larger news organization in the same caliber as the New York Times and the Washington Post in terms of when it gets awards. It's classified in those same categories, and does cover breaking news. Has a newsroom. Has a Capitol Hill reporter, etc. That was your last question. Your first question was viewers. Viewers are on the internet. All on the internet. We don't have any other mechanism. We have some paywall stuff like Apple News Plus, which is a paywall subscription, but it's still mobile, you know, internet based. Our viewers are 18 to 35-year-olds who are mainly in the United States and Canada and Great Britain and Australia, but all over. We have, and for our YouTube analytics tell us that, especially for Borders, we have more people watching outside of the United States than within the United States. And yeah, but they're mainly, I mean, you can see the bell curve, but mainly it's 18 to 35-year-olds with people on both ends. You know, a lot of 35 to 50-year-olds as well, but not as many as that kind of main demographic. How do we make money? That is the big question for all digital media, for all media generally, but digital media especially. We've been able to make it through this first wave. In the United States, there was a lot of digital media groups that came up in kind of 2013, 2014, and a lot of them have gone out of business. Vox has been able to make it through in part because this is going to get really wonky, but you guys might be into this. At Vox, we also have an arm that is an in-house advertising agency. And then we also have an in-house publisher that makes our technology, that makes our CMS, what we use to publish. And so between the ad and the people who make the technology that publishes our stuff on the internet, we're able to go to an advertiser and say, hey, we can make you a custom, beautiful ad campaign that fits right into our whole experience. It's going to be beautiful. It's not going to be a clunky display ad. And your campaign will feel natural and native to the experience. And so because of that, our ad rates are going up, while ad rates for everyone else are going down because we offer this kind of one-stop shop. But then we're experimenting with all sorts of things with different memberships. Now on YouTube, you can go on and pay $5 a month and get behind the scenes content. And we're trying to crack the code. We're doing sponsored videos now, where at the end we say, thank you Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and they pay some amount of money. So we're trying to diversify, but it's a hard question for everyone in digital media. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think there's like I guess a long-term future for this kind of storytelling on the internet? Because from what I've seen, a lot of this kind of storytelling is, I guess you'd say, kind of held hostage by the big distributors like Facebook and Google, who are making a lot of money, but not actually making this kind of content themselves.
Yeah. I am betting that an appetite for what I call curiosity content, which is really well reported. I spend months on these, and I read books and books and think tank reports and talk to dozens of experts to make this 12-minute video that lives on the internet. And that lives next door to a video of someone live streaming their video games that cost them nothing to make. And yet we get the same ad rate by view. And I actually posed this exact question to the CEO of YouTube, who was at our office the other day, and I was able to meet with her, and I said, like, there's no way we can keep doing this if we keep getting paid the cents on the dollar that you're paying all your other creators who are making stuff that takes them no effort at all. And she gave some answer that basically said, like, well, too bad. Like, we don't have to change. Like, we're making plenty of money. Like, so from the corporate YouTube and these big distributors who are the ones who kind of hold all of the cards here because they have a monopoly over this publishing. Yeah, it's a pretty dire situation to say, like, I don't know how we're going to sustain this, but my hope is that with the crisis of fake news, with the crisis of harassment, with the crisis of all of these terrible things that are happening on these platforms, that YouTube will wake up and say, man, we have to fuel this kind of content if we're going to be a beacon of legitimate information and not just a free-for-all for anyone to publish anything. And I think at some point they'll have to wake up to that, and I think at some point the incentives will align that they will have to do that. They'll be forced into it because their advertisers won't want to be a part of it. But that's me speculating. There's demand for this, though. I mean, every one of these seasons, I get 50 million views for like 4 or 5 videos. There are millions of people who want to watch this and who will stick around and watch these 12, 15-minute videos. And so I'm just waiting for the day when it becomes like an actual like corporate priority for rigorous information on these platforms. But who knows? Yeah, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask how much of what you end up shooting is planned and how much is improvisation.
Yeah.
And also if you storyboard with the graphics and everything planned ahead with the script before you go out to the field.
Yeah, I'm going to put a pin in that question because I'm actually going to open up my script and go through literally everything, and then we're going to watch what that script looks like after, and I'll tell you, like, hey, I planned this. This was all. But the short answer is I do as much research as I can on the macro story, on the story that I can learn reading books and talking to experts and reporting from my office. When I get on the ground, the micro story, the human story, is always way more complicated and way different than anything I can conceive of while I'm reading Wikipedia articles. And so that always informs, not usually the arc of the story. The arc of the story is something that usually I can garner from a lot of different places. Oftentimes it'll change slightly, and sometimes it'll change a lot, but it always does inform how the story fills out and how it looks. So we'll see that in detail. Yep.
So it's a general question, but how much time you need to put into a 12 minutes video in terms of preparations? Because there's a lot of pressure on journalists today to produce more and more in less and less time.
Yeah.
And so eventually you come up with a result which is short and tight and looks really great, but how long does it take?
Yeah, it takes a long time for something like this. And my whole idea is that what I do specifically with Borders, like, shouldn't be a model. I'm never going out and saying, like, this is what everyone should be doing, because, like he said, like, this is more like long form, like magazine articles. Like, this is like the New Yorker, where you will read and it will kind of go along like what is happening in the world, but it's not necessarily like breaking news. But I believe that the concepts here of visual first storytelling can be applied to breaking news, can be applied to a social media manager who has to report immediately on what the protests in Hong Kong these past couple of days and is like, well, what do I do? if we're thinking of visual first storytelling on visual platforms, that can inform a 2-hour turnaround or a 2-month turnaround. For me, for 5 videos, I will usually pre-report for 6 weeks. I'll go on the ground for 10 days, and then I'll do post-production for about 8 weeks. And all of that, what's that?
It's a long time.
It's a long time, but it's 5 videos, and they're 5 kind of meaty documentaries. And they are, before we had a bigger team who were covering a bunch of different things, I had to turn stuff around. I had to do a video a week. And now that we have a team who's kind of doing news and doing all this stuff, I've been able to go off and do this. And it's a useful thing because it allows us to have, again, like you have long form magazine articles in addition to breaking news pieces. It gives our audience a lot of different aspects of, but yeah, it takes a long time. It's a lot of work. But it really, people love it and it travels on the internet, you know? So, I don't know. That's why VOX has made it a priority to invest in it.
Surprising that Fox can cover it.
What's that?
It's surprising that Fox can cover it financially.
Well, I'll tell you.
Or they don't pay you.
No, they do. They pay me, but if you were to think what this would cost for a typical documentary production to go out and cover 5 videos that are, 7 to 15 minutes long, and to produce them in the way with graphics and all this stuff, that would be, the salary of 4 or 5 people, probably. What VOX is saying here is if you can be scrappy and do this all on your own, these trips cost me $6,000. $6,000 are all my expenses to go out and travel, especially in a place like Haiti or something where it's not very expensive. I cost VOX $6,000 plus my salary to go out and make 5 of these videos, and they get 50 million views back. Like, it's worth it to them. It's super worth it to them. And then they get 2 Emmy nominations, and it's something that they've seen as actually really good business because it's incredibly cheap relative to what documentary typically costs. Who hasn't? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. So you were saying a few times about you being like a news, kind of a news, and he said something about it, that you report news, you have news kind of media,
Yeah.
and also storytelling. And I think that there's a very fine line that's been being even more and more disintegrated.
Yeah, yeah.
In between, telling the story that you see and reporting.
Yep.
And especially when you say that you're trying to make your stories accessible to the audience,
Yep.
whether it's by visualization, I think that line is could be crossed very easily. And I'm talking just like informative things that you do. I guess I'm wondering how often you ask yourself, is this really informative, or is this our subjective kind of view that we are bringing in an informative kind of way?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's a question like every journalist has to ask themselves always, even if you're doing breaking news. Like, as long as you're pressing the buttons to report a story, you're filtering it through your brain. I think the notion of objectivity is largely a myth, in the sense that, like, as long as you're presenting a story in an order with facts that you've chosen and talk to experts that you chose to talk to, you have to funnel it. Now, I agree with you that there are much bigger, like a story like this, I'm piecing together 10 different elements into a narrative that I've chosen. And so the degree of those variables is now much slipperier. And that's what a good editor's for, Like, I have a good editor who is able to poke and ask these questions and push and say, well, what does the facts say? And like, what like, why are you saying this? This feels like a little bit like you're imposing a little bit. And she's very rigorous in making sure that everything we say is assertive in a factual way. And then we have a very intense fact-checking process that allows us to check our characterizations, check our numbers, check whatever. And between all of that, we feel like we're able to button it up. But no, I don't pretend to say that somehow this is some firm objective, especially because I'm using fancy graphics and fancy camera moves and music, all this stuff that's like very subjective, very artful. And so I'm okay with that. I guess I'm not saying that, I guess I don't see that as something bad, as long as we are not misleading or mischaracterizing an issue that we've reported. So anyway, it's a slippery slope for sure. Go ahead.
I have a question about you in Borders.
Mhm.
How and when do you find your fingerprints? Like your signature is very like when you see a VOX video you made, it's very like you can see it's your video. And in a time like everybody make good videos and find rigorous things, how do you find your own?
So for me, maps and visual storytelling with maps is something I love. I really love it, and I feel like it's a really powerful thing to show geodata. I do a lot of like cartography and geodata, and being able to show those macro trends on a map and then zoom in and show a human story. I feel like that balance is what I really love. Maps and then like visual, like what I call visual anchors, which you'll see here pretty soon. So yeah, I guess that's kind of become my like format of choice or container of choice is maps, and then cinematography. I really believe that good cinematography can be good journalism because cinematography is the art of showing someone something in a way that connects with their brain, and it's always kind of been seen as like, oh no, the like fancy, like people who have a lot of time and money can do fancy cinematography. But even with short videos, when we're covering turnarounds, like quick turnaround stuff, we try to employ really good artful cinematography because it's descriptive and it's factual. It can be factual if you're pointing your camera at visual evidence that proves the thing you're trying to say. So yeah, I would say those are maybe my kind of ideas or trademarks. Yeah, a couple more questions, then we're going to move on. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm curious about your work process. I understand that on the ground you're a one-man show.
Yeah.
But in the week before the post-production,
no.
you collaborate with?
Yes. So back in these days, I was pretty solo. I had an editor who I would bounce ideas off of. Since then, I now have a assistant producer who is like the fact guru, and she goes out, and I'm like, hey, we need to get all the data of fishermen who were arrested in the Palk Strait from this date to this date, and she'll like go scour the internet and call people and figure it out. And visuals, she'll go and find archive and this and that. So she's just like the person who knows where to look for archive and facts and data. And then I have on the team someone who I call a story producer, and her name is Christina, and she has become more and more fundamental in helping find the story and say, hey, this is a visual story. Like, hey, we're going to India. What are we going to cover? So then she'll go out, I'll go out, we'll both like go out and look for stories, we'll come together, and she will usually help flesh out a lot of those stories. She's like what would be a producer in kind of radio, like radio producer who like goes out, isn't the reporter, but is like very closely entwined with the videos. And then I'm more and more, like she's doing an edit for one of the video, like she wants to learn editing, she wants to learn motion graphics, so I'm giving her one of the edits and kind of coaching her through that. And hopefully she'll be taking that more and more. So that's the main ones. And then of course my editor is still there. She's editor, like story editor, not video editor. And then we have, of course, our social media people and engagement team. They help run the crowdsourcing, all of the engagement stuff, which is itself, wizardry. And then, of course, all the people at VOX who just make the team run, like that's obviously like, so it is a one-man band, but it's not at all. It's like, it's very much this giant group of people. I just happen to be the one on the ground with the camera and doing the editing and graphics and stuff. But without all of these other people, it wouldn't be nearly as rigorous and it just wouldn't go as far. So let's do one more question and then we're going to talk about scripts and stories, or we'll just do that now. Oh, yes, sorry.
When you do Borders, you also do these small unrelated videos, like in Japan you did about business cards and stuff
Yeah.
Do you go with the intent to make other small videos, or just that?
So that's an old format actually. So we used to, in season 1, I was going to all these places and just doing one video in each place. And then I was doing these dispatches, which were totally unplanned, like vlogs of like, why are there so many vending machines in Japan? And like these little quirky things that have cool kind of economic explanations or something. We kind of retired those in the name of doing 5 videos in one place. And each of those videos is now, some of them are a little bit lighter, like why are there so many neon signs in Hong Kong, and the kind of interesting developments around that. But they're now more reported. And so they're like taking that old format and blending it with the bigger format. And now we do 5. Yeah, they're all planned out now, and at least somewhat planned out to the point where they're not just spontaneous. It was just too much burden to like show up to a place and be like, I need to come up with a really pithy like macroeconomic explanation for this thing on the fly, and I'm like at my hotel like reading and like calling people, and it's just wasn't. It was a little too ambitious for like spur of the moment. Okay, so some of you asked about process, and what I want to show you is scripts. So how we find stories is based on what can be shown visually, and this is a huge tenet of mine. With like, if I'm going to be in the business of doing video, why go out and do video? Why spend all these weeks and months and resources doing this if it's not a visual thing? And I feel like that's the number one mistake made in video, is like people just like, oh, it should be a video because the kids like video these days. I don't believe that's true. I think we should find stories that have a visual, and usually you can find a good visual for every story. But you should find stories, if you are looking for interesting stories, visuals should lead. So this script is, this 3-column thing is what I've kind of developed for Borders. It has all these color coding, and I'm not saying this is like sacred. Like this is all just stuff that helps me think through, you know, like fact checking. So everything that needs a fact check is red. When I'm writing it, I'll be like, this is an assertion that is or is not true, like make it red. And then we go through, and once it's sourced in this 3rd column and has a hyperlink and has the fact and the source well put there, then it turns green. And then we have Christina, the producer, then we'll go through and check all of those at the end to make sure they're all good. Sound bites, like sound bites from interviews are in blue here, stuff that I'm supposed to shoot on the ground. So when I'm writing this, I have this ready to go. Like as I'm writing, I'm thinking, if I'm going to start this video out talking about the crisis at the border with Venezuela and Colombia, I need action of people at the border, I need people crossing, I need chaos, and then I need to do this on-camera stuff, and then I need an animation of people flowing from 2015 to the most recent, okay? And you'll see these visual anchors. Visual anchors are everything. They are the heart and soul. Like, you might look at this and be like, oh, the heart and soul of these videos is the fancy camera transitions. No, like those are like the icing on top of the cake. The story here are these visual anchors. They are things that you can point your camera out that exist in the world, that are physical pieces of evidence that show whatever it is you're trying to say. This story, 12 minutes long about Colombia, is trying to say one thing, which is Colombia's border crisis is different than a lot of other border crises because they're actually letting people in. They're like opening their doors, which you just don't see very often. That's what I want to say. So all of the visual anchors throughout the entire piece are supposed to say that in some way without me having to explicitly make the connection. The viewer should be able to do that. When I'm thinking about a story, I'm thinking about what visual anchors are the best. I'm going to put those up front to show people, like to get them bought in and get them saying like, wow, I understand this thing because I'm looking at these different things. So the intro to this piece has the first visual anchor, which is just a ton of people at this border. And then it has a visual anchor of people carrying suitcases across, which is a really powerful indication. They're leaving Venezuela, never to come back. And then you have this visual anchor of this money, this Venezuelan money that's not worth anything. So now they're using it for other purposes.
That was written before you.
Yes. This is most of this. Sometimes I'll get on there and I'll be like, whoa, there's a visual anchor that like I didn't even think of, but it connects. What's funny about these visual anchors is every other news organization has covered them, but they're not using them as visual anchors. Like the money sculpture thing, which again, you'll see what that looks like. I saw several reports before I went down of people covering that, but it was like at the very end, and it was like a little, and now they're making money. Their money's been turned into sculptures, and I'm like, that's gold. Like, why isn't that like the focus, you know? And so anyway, so this is kind of what it looks like. You have the title slate, and then there's a couple other ones, like this hot dog visual anchor, what I didn't have before. So anyway, let's watch this, and I'll call out these visual anchors. You'll see them, because this is what I'm thinking about when I'm looking for stories and when I'm on the ground. They're the most important thing.
You know who you're gonna interview before?
No, not in a case like this. In a case like this, it's like, we're on a border with a bunch of migrants, and we just have to go around and get sound bites from people. Every once in a while, we'll have a source lined up for a very specific purpose. Like in India, there's a Muslim family who's been discriminated against because of their consumption of meat, because they consume cow meat, beef, and their father had been killed by these cow vigilantes. And I was like, that's a compelling story that proves this point. And so I worked for months to get in with those people. But for something like this, it's like people on the ground. Okay, so let's just watch this. And now that you've kind of seen the script and you see the thinking, this will make a lot more sense on what I was shooting for here.
There is a crisis here.
Okay, so visual anchor number one, just a lot of people. You're like, okay, there's a crisis here, tons of people. Like that, no one has to say that. You see it.
Millions of people have fled Venezuela as the country crumbles. Many of them are coming over this border into Colombia. Here in this border town of Cucuta, you see people with suitcases full of all their belongings.
Okay, so this is the second one. This is the second visual anchor. It's another one that just, it dawns on you what's happening here purely because you're seeing it. I could have said that or written it somewhere, but it just wouldn't sink in. You see these people carrying, there's loads of suitcases. It proves the point.
They don't know where they're going, they just know they need to get out of their country. If you need proof of how bad it is in Venezuela right now, look at this purse. This purse is made entirely of the bills of the Venezuelan currency, the bolívares. Inflation is so high that this money is now completely worthless. And so my friend Jorge over here has gathered a ton of this stuff and turned it into commodities, into purses, into sculptures.
It's worse than it sounds. And it's
What's that?
That was pre-research? You knew
Yes, not Jorge. Like, I didn't know Jorge or whatever. I just knew there are people who are making sculptures out of money. That's the money sculptures. That's like, and that was like in everyone's report, like buried at the back. And I was just like, this is gold. And they're not showing it. They're just using it as a gimmick. Whereas like, I feel this is like a really powerful thing and put in line with all these other visual anchors. You're starting as a newcomer. A bunch of people are newcomers to this story. They have no idea where Venezuela is. A lot of the viewers. But they're starting to piece together in the first 1 minute. They're starting to piece together what's going on because the visuals have done all of the work. And I've been able to say some words here and there to kind of give meaning, but the visuals are doing all of the work.
The country's inflation rate will rise to 1,000,000%.
Esto lo que yo tengo aquí, el que tuviera esto en Venezuela tenía plata, era millonario.
More than 1 million Venezuelans have moved into Colombia in recent years. And in an era of record-setting migration, when borders seem to be getting thicker, harder to cross, Colombia is doing something that you don't see very often. It's opening its doors and it's letting people in.
Okay, so I'll use like the stylistic, like big synthy music stuff to make it like energetic and fun to watch. Like in the sense that like, in as much as I'm going to be giving people facts and visual information, I want it to still be fun and interesting and like to get people the endurance to stick around.
Do you think more like a lot on the first 10, 15 seconds, as they always talk about, you have to give them the first 10 seconds?
Yes, but I believe in the first 10 and 15 seconds for a different reason. A lot of people will frame it as like, you got to catch them or they're going to be gone. I believe instead of that, instead of like, oh, people are searching for entertainment, you better like lock them in with some catchy visual. My idea is like tell them what you're going to tell them. Like give them a promise, a visual promise or a story promise, and say like in these first 10 or 15 seconds is like you're throwing out there like, hey, this is what you're going to learn, and this is like a vibe of what you're going to get. And yeah, I totally believe in the idea of front-loading your best visual anchors because it's a promise to your viewer of like what they're going to get. And then you of course have to deliver on that promise. If you don't deliver, that's the greatest sin of all. But if you deliver on that, then that really instills a sense of like, okay, like these people promised something cool and they gave me something cool. All right, I'm going to give you one more visual anchor on the other side of the slate here, just to give you an idea of what these look like, and then I want to talk about kind of structure and how to think about visual anchors.
This border town of Cúcuta is now totally bustling. This is the very end of the border, right as people are entering. Then the one thing that you'll hear that is a little interesting is se compra cabello. We buy hair. So you continue on their way to make some money as the women will sell their hair. Basically get 100,000 pesos, which is like $30.
Okay, visual anchor right there. Like you don't need to explain anything to say, look at the desperation that's happening here. These people have to sell their hair. That's one that I didn't know about. I went down there, saw it, and said, that proves the point better than anything I could ever say. Let's go cover that.
I'm eating a Venezuelan-style hot dog, and the guys are reflecting on how much this hot dog would cost if they were trying to buy in Venezuela with the current economic situation.
87% of the country's households into poverty.
Images that we have just never seen in Latin America before.
Okay, so all of that, visual anchor after visual anchor after visual anchor, the hot dog, the hair, whatever it was, you can't just have a video or a piece that's just all visual anchors. You need to have what I call like a bridge in between them. So like all of that was visual anchors. You need context if people are going to start to understand this. And context is not going to be as rich in visual evidence. It's going to be more ancillary visuals like B-roll, like here, I'm going to turn this down and we'll just watch some of it. But it's B-roll meaning like footage that is associated with, but is not, let's see here, but is not direct visual evidence of whatever we're talking about. Here, I'll just do it right here actually. So after all those visual anchors, we now get
the collapse of Venezuela didn't happen
a history section.
War or a natural disaster, but rather the colossal
this shot, I could have done 15 different, 100, 1,000 different shots of, closed down stores and store. It's kind of visual evidence, but it's more indirectly related.
In just a few years, Maduro grabbed control of most of the government and then drove the country into an economic disaster worse than the Great Depression and the fall of the Soviet Union.
Okay, so a story can't be all visual anchors. It needs stitching or it needs something to bridge the gap in between them. I'll only go so long before I got to get to the next visual anchor. So I'll go, and my next visual anchor is going to be a data visualization.
In the midst of this crisis, about 1 million...
This right here, this is visual evidence. Colombia's taken in way more than everyone else around. This is a piece of evidence that you can show someone. And then you can show that they...
like most countries in the region, has been to put up new measures.
That all these other countries are putting up increased security and Colombia's not. So that's a really powerful one. Anyway, so this idea of anchor, bridge, is it's my formula. And it might sound simple, but finding those visual anchors is hard. And that's where the reporting comes in. That's the majority of my reporting. There's a lot of context and numbers and stuff, but a lot of it is hunting for those visuals and hunting for what's best going to show this trend or this issue with visuals. Yep.
So you're saying it's basically a strong visual thing you don't have to explain in words, and then an explanation, and another one.
Yeah, exactly. If you and just depending, like for a newcomer to this issue, they won't know the history. Like I've given them enough context to say like, whoa, something big's going on here. This is crazy. What's happening? Venezuela's in crisis. If I'm going to then teach them like what this has, like what meaning this has, it then has to be a little bit more of this kind of zoom out and talk about the history and talk about that. But I think that's more specific to my format in the sense that it's explainer. Explainer for us means we're trying to get in 15 minutes or 11 minutes or whatever, someone to come on the other side and say, oh, I have a pretty good idea of like what this crisis is about and what's happening.
When you explain, you have the, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
But you have the, like in the Israeli conflict, you have the Russian perspective, the United States perspective, the natives perspective. Yep. How you choose to explain in the right way.
Yeah. So explainer usually is not perspective based. Explainer is supposed to be our objective, and again, back to the earlier comment, like I don't believe that there's any true objective anything that is put in a linear form. Like we make decisions, but explainer is supposed to be the Wikipedia article where you go and you can say, okay, in 2015, inflation was this much and the country started to collapse. And so a lot of people started to leave. That's what explainer is. In terms of the perspectives and stuff, that is much more subject to bias, and that's a hard decision. Yeah, for the Israeli-Palestinian one, like you have to make decisions, and you can argue with what the best mix is. But as journalists, like that's what we're doing. Like we can't talk to literally every single person, otherwise we're political scientists, and even then they're making decisions. So we choose based on what we think is a generous mix of perspectives, but it's never gonna like meet the standard of some perfectly objective sample, I believe.
Because if you just say they are fucked up, they're so, like, you know, they're not like the Western world, something bad about them, but you know, from their perspective, the Western world come to them.
Of course, yeah.
Took everything
I mean,
from them.
it's information on the internet, like
No, you know,
yeah.
when you don't show it, you know, to many people they can see it as something wrong with the people.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, that's a fair criticism. Yeah, like I say, my thought is that there's always going to be, you can pick apart any 11-minute video and say, well, you know, technically you didn't include this and this and this. There's always something more to include, and that's actually as someone who comes from an academic background, I constantly struggle with like, well, if we added 6 more minutes to this, we could go into this whole other thing. With this one specifically, by the way, we did a whole Venezuela explainer, why the collapse of Venezuela explained, which was a whole go at Chavez and the history of Venezuela. And so I felt less of the burden to take that on because I feel like on our channel a few months earlier we had done like a very holistic look at it. Go ahead.
The people in this video spoke in Spanish, or the other video in, I don't know, the language of Dominican Republic.
Yeah.
Do VOX pay for a translator to go with you? Or?
So I speak Spanish, and so in this case, and in Dominican Republic, which is another Spanish-speaking country, I didn't need a translator. In Haiti, they were speaking Creole, which is, and I usually will travel with a fixer translator. In some, what's that?
A mobile, not a person.
No, a person on the ground who is in charge of basically like showing me the lay of the land. Sometimes I won't. Like when I was in Israel actually reporting, I didn't have a fixer, which I probably should have. And basically someone who can help me get into places, who speaks the language, who can help me set up things beforehand. Those are usually locals, though. They're usually locals who do this for.
This is another salary.
What's that? Yeah, it's a day rate. You know, in Haiti, it's $60 a day. You know, that budget I said earlier includes fees. Yeah.
I noticed that you avoid longer interviews.
Yep.
For me, a good interview is great visuals.
Totally.
You don't do it.
Yeah. Sometimes.
You don't do micro stories. You do macro stories.
Exactly. These are macro stories. These are macro explanations with.
Sometimes when you go in a micro story, you have the good story.
Oh, totally. There's amazing stories.
Time for the micro story, only macro.
For my format, it's much more of a macro story. It's an explainer, and that's the format I do. There are other people who do micro stories, who do amazing micro stories. The New York Times OpDoc series does amazing micro stories, and cheers to them. Like that's a great thing. My format is much more of a broad, geopolitical or kind of macro level, academically informed approach with some micro elements that help humanize or give a face to that trend. But by no means is it supposed to be a nuanced micro story about one person's story or sojourn within this. Yeah.
Is your trajectory of creating your stories the same if you're actually taking the visuals versus given visuals? And how would you use the same idea of visual anchors if you're given visuals?
And this is where we go back to that kind of original idea of the power of having writer and technician come together. Because when I'm here writing the script, I'll be sitting here looking at this script, and I am immediately, like this middle column, I don't write a paragraph here without having something that goes there. And because I know how to animate stuff, and because I know how to shoot stuff, I'm able to put direction here that feels exactly natural to what I would want to put there. If I were just given a bunch of stuff, it would be much harder, because I write this, it's called visual first writing. We write with the idea of specific visuals that we want to get, and we write to the visuals. We say, look at this map, look at this thing. If you watch VOX videos, you'll hear a lot of, this is something, and it's like circling something on a document in animation, and we're in a voiceover booth not looking at anything, and we're saying, this is a trend that blah, 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 and we're speaking to the visuals because we know what it is before we ever wrote it. And so I'm not saying that everyone needs to be a cinematographer or an animator in order to do this, but having a familiarity to be able to say, I understand what my animator is capable of, or I'm aware, I can speak the language, is going to make anyone a stronger writer, I believe. Because concrete visual writing, I think, is easier to visualize, but it's also just easier to understand.
Just one more question.
Yeah.
I noticed a lot of your VOX videos, you don't have subtitles on them. Is there a reason you see a difference between the viewership if you...
You mean like baked in, like ones that are like, because usually we'll have like on YouTube, you can go in and put subtitles in a bunch of different languages here.
Right, something like your Facebook one, I guess.
Yeah, so, and that's another one. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but we've found that we do these community guided subtitles where people are able to, all these different languages, they're able to submit them. And then they can be peer reviewed, and then we can give them a review as well with Google Translate. So it's not like 100% accuracy, but it's reviewed enough to we know where it's not like a hoax or something. And then we'll publish them, and then we'll take that caption file and we'll upload it to Facebook. In fact, that's what we did with this. No, actually, we translated these. We did it with, I think it might have been Hong Kong. It was some other one that allowed us to penetrate this whole other market on Facebook. Suddenly, it was like going viral in like Brazil, and we're like, whoa! And that's because we uploaded Portuguese or something. I don't remember the exact example. So we use the internal caption system because it allows it to then spread in the algorithms of all these other markets. That if we just had English subtitles burned in, it wouldn't do. It wouldn't be able to have that reach. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was interested in the way you kind of construct the story, especially in a story as complex and as big as that.
Yeah.
Heavily covered.
Yeah.
So your format is, you know, like you say a small introduction where you promise your viewers what you're going to get.
Yeah.
And you give little snippets of the news, and
Yep.
then you delve deeper into the history. So how does that change in relation to the story you tell?
Yeah.
I mean, if you tell bigger stories, then how do you construct them? If you tell
Yeah.
small stories in like Hong Kong architecture, how do you do that?
Yeah, so sometimes those will just, some stories feel like they have a natural backbone. Like I'm working on this Sri Lanka, India fishing story right now that it just feels like the narrative is just there in terms of like, there's a natural history to it. It just feels very clear. Stories like this where I've collected 10 different things and now I have to place them in some linear fashion, I usually will follow a similar model, which is, I call it, look at this thing, that's the intro, look at this thing, and then zoom out, talk about the context, and then zoom back in and look at some other things. So, look at this thing is this whole beginning, and it's the money, it's the hair, it's the suitcases, it's, okay, you just looked at all this and like you now get it. Let's zoom out and talk context. Okay, it's an explainer, it's history, sound bites, B-roll, and now let's dive back in. And the rest of the piece are look at these things, but much bigger ones. So now I'm in this camp, and there's this whole camp where they have this like thing where they sing, the Venezuelans and the Colombians are singing, and they're having this like big bonding moment, and everyone's crying, and it's like I stumbled upon this somehow. And then it's, now I'm talking to Colombians who are literally letting Venezuelans live in their house as a part of this informal program that is like, that they're just doing. That's another piece of evidence. And then it's, what else is it? And then it's, I don't know what the last piece is.
So even as you flick through this YouTube, you can see that you kind of plant the bigger facts in between micro stories, or at least
yeah, there will always be, I feel like, a piece of macro that needs to go to every little thing. So I'll sprinkle those out, but in terms of like the big story, it's usually look at this thing, a big macro context, and then other look at this things that usually do have a little bit of, like, they need facts or they need something to give them meaning.
And you found that format to really be
Yeah.
efficient in any kind of large scale?
I would say so. It helps me. I think the viewer, after a look at this thing, they're like bought in. They're like, what is this? And then they will sit through 4 minutes of history and context. That is necessary. They have to learn this. But you've energized them by, like, this is very satisfying visuals that are teaching you something. Now you're going to sit through the hard stuff, the data, the B-roll, the archive, the dates, the facts, the stuff that most people will want to navigate away from on the internet. They're now bought in. And then hopefully they'll stick around. Our retention rate's about 70%. So 70% of people will finish, which is, yeah, bananas on the internet. But again, you earn their attention, they'll stick around. We're winding down. Let's do a few more questions, and then we'll close. 5 more? Okay, great. Did you have a question? Or no? Sorry, I thought I saw this. Okay.
What about like external footage? I mean, like news. You have
Yep.
news
Yep.
shows and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
do you have any rights? And also, when you interview some people, do you need to sign them on contracts?
So news stuff. In the U.S., I don't know how it works in other places, but in the U.S. we have this media law precedent called fair use. Yeah, do you guys, I don't know about fair use, but basically the idea is if you are showing that a certain piece of content or a certain topic was a part of the public conversation during a time, like for example, the civil or the kind of civil war with the FARC in Colombia in the 80s and 90s. I want to show that that's a big thing. So I go find 3 different newscasters saying, the FARC has taken over big swaths of land in southern Colombia. And then the next newscaster said, and hundreds of thousands have fled their homes. And the next newscaster says something like that. If I put those all 3 together, that's fair use. I've now shown that it's a part of the thing, part of the like public conversation, and media law says I can use that. And we can use that not just on the internet, on TV. Like that is fair game for documentaries, for anything. In other cases, if I want to license a piece of footage that doesn't fall within fair use, I'll have to license it, like from a stock site or from a news organization. In terms of appearance releases for people, yes, I need to get an appearance release from anyone who appears on camera. When I'm on the border and I'm talking to this lady or this Jorge, who's like, I don't get an appearance release. And he could technically come sue us and make us take it down, but I don't think he will. So it just depends the situation. Like a lot, especially these migrants, like I give them this big document that like signs away, and it just feels very intimidating. And I'm like, if I was publishing on TV, I would have to do this.
You could get the release on camera.
And I do, and I get them saying, if I say, am I allowed to film you? They say yes. That's like, yeah. My lawyers say that's not fine, but I'm like. My lawyer's like, well, technically you need this, and sometimes they'll push me, and I'm like, man, like, I'm like, when I'm running gun and I'm like sitting there like, hey, can you talk to me for 3 minutes? And then I'm like, pull out this long paper, let's translate it and read it. It's not gonna happen. So anyway, yeah, my lawyers are not, like the lawyers at VOX would love if everything was buttoned up, but they've given us a little bit of leeway because this stuff is not a lightning rod for people suing us. Like we're telling these people stories and it's never been a problem. But we try whenever it's possible. When we do big interviews and stuff, like we'll obviously get a release. No. VOX, we've had people want us to take stuff down, but it's corporations who like you're using our music or something. Like my friend Estelle, my colleague, does a thing called Earworm, which is like a music explainer. She'll break down songs and do this kind of educational thing on music. And the record labels always come around and have her take it down, even though she's using 3 seconds of a piece to annotate it, which technically fair use is allowed, but they push, and we just don't want to fight it, so we take stuff down. But no, like when it's telling people stories, no one ever comes around like have us take stuff down. Anyway, I keep forgetting. I'm sorry, guys. Yeah.
Quick question: VOX Explained series on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
Was that inspired by stuff that you were doing on social, or was that something that you said we want to create it especially for Netflix?
So it was totally inspired by our previous work, and specifically Borders and this work, but also all of the kind of animated work that we do on YouTube was the precedent for Explained, which is a Netflix show that are like
created especially for Netflix.
Yes, it's only on Netflix, and they wanted to try this new idea of explainers that pull off a topic and try to give a broad understanding of it. And I would say that we've landed somewhere in the middle between kind of TV documentary and a true VOX explainer. Like, it's kind of landed in this middle ground where it definitely has that VOX DNA, but it definitely has its own personality. But yeah, the heart of it is inspired, and it's created by, like, I did one of the episodes, and my other colleagues kind of did some of the episodes, some of the people who were there at the beginning of VOX to kind of help inject some of that stylistic approach. But it's very different working on a big TV crew where I wasn't going out and shooting, I was directing, you know, and suddenly I'm like, ooh, I'm not very good at this. Like, I want to go back to, like, being able to touch the camera where I can actually think of the visuals, you know, like that was my kind of experience. But my other colleagues have really enjoyed the experience of being on TV. All right, let's do one last question. Okay.
So you have your own style, and you like shot a film in Colombia, and you come back to the US. How do you balance the things you like and shots you like and style you have with other people?
Yeah. That's where my editor comes in. So my editor, Mona, who's an amazing journalist and leader, and she is the filter. So she's the one, we have a good relationship, and she just has no qualms with being like, this is heavy-handed. You're indulging your obsession with drones, like settle down. Like, the music here's a little too much. Like, she will go in, and she doesn't have any attachment to the story, and she just sits there and pokes holes in it and strengthens it in a way that makes it a better piece of journalism, but also sensitive and factually accurate and you know, tonally accurate. All of these things that I maybe get lost in when I'm in the weeds and I'm in kind of the artistic obsession of it, but she helps balance that out. And I mean, I can't say enough about having a good editor who just will do that and have that relationship, but also respect your vision, but also guide it in a way that makes it the best it can be and the most accurate. And I would be lost without her. So, all right. Well, thank you everyone for this. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate it.